CTSA leadership up here to take their places at the on the hot seat, or the hot table. Paul Marantz at that end is co-PI and Associate Dean for Clinical Research Education and Mentoring, which reminds me to wave this handout that you see outside and remind you that the posters are the real pièce de résistance when you go for lunch. Paul and his team organized the posters. Many of them are from career development awardees of the CTSA and others on the faculty and pilot projects as well. Dr. Shlomo Shinnar is well known to you. He's a neuroscientist and neurologist, pediatric neurologist, who heads our regulatory expertise group. Rick Kaskel is a pediatric nephrologist and member of the CTSA Child Health Oversight Group and vice chair of pediatrics at Montefiore. And Hal Strelnick, who's pushed himself out of the way here, is well known to all of you as our leader in the community engagement space. So I would like to start off the questions by reminding Hal to remind the audience about the community collaborative research review process, which was funded under CTSA supplement, and where we are with that, because it really engages Joann's group in a meaningful way that we've been talking about. Do you want to summarize that briefly? Really briefly, because I want to make sure there's time for questions from the audience as well as the panel.
So part of the Bronx Center to reduce and eliminate ethnic and racial health disparities, or Bronx CREED, as well as the CTSA, is a model that we've sort of tried to adapt from Native American tribal governments of a Bronx community-based review board, which is going to sit at the Bronx Health Link, and which is basically a place for any investigator to bring their ideas as a sounding board, to have an engagement with the community, so that you don't need to start your own community advisory board from the get-go, but can have a place to go. And Joann is in the process of working by looking at other models in other communities, Hartford and others that are a little farther ahead on how to do that. And we're hoping that it will be up and running by spring.
Thanks, Hal. So why don't we start the conversation at the other end, Paul? How do you bridge undiagnosed diseases and individuals who don't have access to health care?
Something Joann said at the end that really, I thought, spoke to something that Bill said at the beginning of his talk, which was the issue of managing expectations in communication. You were saying, Joann, that we really need to do a better job at sharing our findings and their import with the community. But as I think most people in this audience know, we in medical science tend to be very enthusiastic about the potential meaning of our findings in a way that may sometimes tend to oversell that. And Bill spoke of that tension in bringing people into this undiagnosed disease program. I'm wondering what you have to say about that.
You know, your research is wonderful. I mean, I was really impressed by what you were speaking about earlier. Some of it made no sense to me, I'm sorry to say.
Some of it makes no sense to me.
The last time I took physics or biology, I was quite young and don't understand. But if you could just figure out a way to take your emotional connection to the patients that you see and the people who write to you, and let people know how much feeling and care goes into what you provide. I think that's very important. I think that there is a disconnect oftentimes in the community. You know, you're seen as the white coats, very sort of businesslike, and you need to, I think there needs to be a bridge so that people really understand the importance of your research and that it's out there and that people know that it's going on and that it's going to benefit them.
Yeah, and we do that on a personal level when we see our patients, because our team is really very attached and dedicated. But to do it on a broader level, you know, there are only a certain number of fora in which you can do that.
Yep. The other question that I guess I would also pose to the group to consider is, as we engage with the Vanderbilt group, there's a project that Dan probably knows about peripherally called ResearchMatch.org, and this is to create a national database of people who are entering their own personal information into a secure website and making themselves available as research volunteers. And a number of our investigators have been talking about that, and our team is part of the group that will be participating in that. And I think last year we learned from Paloma that the Bronx is heavily, the computers and the internet are pervasive, and in fact that access to remote information is no longer the impediment. And I think that the other thing you mentioned is data. And how important it is to data. I learned that last night at the pro bono and award ceremony. And I think that, if nothing else, academic medical centers are great at producing large amounts of data, and sharing that information is really part of our mandate to help you do your work. So I think there are these links that we forget that we have at our disposal sometimes that crop up daily. Shlomo.
So I have a couple comments and some questions. So first, as a child neurologist, I was struck by the percentage of your patients that are neurologic diseases and children. I guess confirming what all of us child neurologists believe, that we deal with very difficult cases. But there are, in fact, a large number of diseases that we deal with, and that some of my colleagues in other subspecialties deal with, that may be a little better defined, that you're totally undiagnosed, but are in fact quite rare. And so from the community point of view, it's very difficult to try and educate a community about a disease in which I see 5 a year. So what I find is that when I'm doing research in those diseases that are multi-center, that even though I've never met these folks before, I rely on my colleagues at Montefiore, and that as a community we provide good service. And so those who are part of the Montefiore network seem to have trust in us. Those who come to us from other Bronx hospitals have less trust in the white coat. But so it's more, we establish the trust not necessarily by educating about the disease, but broadly speaking, we mean well. But the question is, so NIH has this wonderful model, but going back to this morning's earlier speaker, what do you do with diseases where each major center can contribute 2 to 3 a year? And therefore the economy of scale doesn't exist, and it's extraordinarily expensive because you need about 30 sites to get 100, 150 patients. And so industry, there's no money, and for NIH, the base cost per institution, there are some core costs to setting up a site. There are these rare disease consortia that NIH somewhat funds if you have 3 of them, but they're still, depending how rare or not rare you are, how do we bridge the gap? And this kind of goes back to this morning's speakers too, of studying diseases that are rare, though they may teach us more broadly, as you pointed out, about as a model for other diseases in that class that may be less rare. Prolonged QT being an excellent example of what causes chaotic heart rhythms. How does one go about doing that? A question near and dear to, I suspect, quite a few people in this audience.
Well, it's a patchwork right now. You mentioned one of the things. The Office of Rare Disease Research does fund sort of centers of excellence, which are consortia surrounding rare diseases, like the channelopathies, like urea cycle defects. I think there's a pulmonary one, etc. So a bunch of centers put in for this money, and I think the money amount is $1.5 million a year for 5 years. So it's sort of reasonable, and that brings together some of those patients that are seen, at those centers. Ooh, thank you. My voice got better, I guess. So that's one thing. In addition, the NIH intramural program has a very large number of experts in rare diseases, And patients can come to the NIH intramural program. A lot of people don't actually know this, I think. And, of course, everything's free there. So if they qualify for a protocol, they can come, and then you can have an expert in a disease, which is the one thing that I always tell at public meetings like this, that really finding a gene goes very little towards actually helping people. What you need is an expert who can tell you, is this part of the disease or isn't it part of the disease, et cetera, et cetera. But really, that's not much of an answer for you, Shlomo. The real issue is that that's still a problem that stands, that the NIH, by policy, does not fund clinical studies worth a darn. And the only way that they're going to in the future, I think, is through the Office of Rare Diseases if it gets more money. There are some registries that are being planned for these. But, registries are not exactly the same as actually caring for patients.
I think a topic that a number of you have sort of circled around also is the physician workforce really ready for genomic medicine. Dan wants just coded red and blue like the H and L designations on lab reports, and we're not even sure we have a disease. We're not ready to acknowledge our ignorance when we're with the patient. So what are we going to do with the gap in knowledge about how to apply genomic information? And the epigenome hasn't been mentioned today, although it might have been last night. Any thoughts, Bill or Dan? Obviously, curriculum change in the medical school is a big part of that, but that's going to take 10 years to filter down.
Well, I think it will take a long time. I think a lawsuit here or there is probably what's going to stimulate things.
See, Joann?
Practical.
Audience, I've asked these guys to comment, but comments, questions? Yes. Could you speak a little louder? Or?
Sure. I have a comment for Joann. I'm at Albert Einstein, the Children's Evaluation and Rehabilitation Center. And I just want to let you know we should be partners because the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research has funded us. We're a center that is part of Einstein, and we seek probably center-wide maybe over 1,000 children, and we certainly for children with developmental disabilities, but a huge portion of our population right now are children that are at risk for child maltreatment. In the Bronx, there's nearly 40,000 children that are known to preventive services, which means that these children are at risk for being maltreated, although they're still able to live with their parents, because the thinking is if we put supports in place, we can keep these families together. So I just want to draw your attention that in some ways, I think the ivory tower is, there's a rope down that clinicians are beginning to step up to and address some of the real life concerns of families in the Bronx. In addition, not to take more time, but part of our funding is to look at the high rates of obesity and diabetes in the moms of these young children. So, I think that see our poster that's presented, but I think there is some openness in reaching out to the community. So we should get to know you as well.
And we're open to sort of bridge you to other CBOs because we may not be the most appropriate fit, but we know a lot of folks in the Bronx. So maybe the goal is for the Bronx Health Link to sort of open the door for you to meet other people and then sort of let you go. Yeah.
Well, we just created a research collaboration zone on the Einstein website that's more academic than community-centered. But it's actually a first step, and I really think that the stories aren't being told. Now, this point of light, and this was not a planted comment, but thank you, Ann. The point is that it's knowing the unknowable. Somebody said that earlier, and there's so much unknowable, even in our relatively small, circumscribed community, that, and I think your investigators are probably listening to, oh my goodness, I could publish in El Diario. That's fine. They just didn't know the community would welcome that kind of outreach, as is our communications department listening very carefully, I suspect. Paul?
You're Dr. Murphy, yes?
Yes.
well, even within our community, it's nice to meet after email communication. But I do want to just put in a word from our sponsor, the ICTR and the CTSA. Dr. Murphy's talking about a pilot grant that she was awarded under the auspices of the CTSA. We have, with some stimulus money, had the opportunity to put out an RFA for a new type of pilot grants specifically geared towards community-engaged research. Joann will be joining us soon in our review of these grants, and with a very short turnaround, we had an overwhelming response, so we thank the community. There's a lot of great ideas. As is always the case, we won't be able to fund the majority of them, but we are very glad to see how much good work is going on.
Yes.
Hi, good morning. I'm Barbara Harden, actually. I'm the program manager for Bronx Breeze under Hal Strelnick, and I'm also a student of Dr. Marantz. One of the things I just wanted to add on to what Joann was saying, that we need some sort of forum in the community so they can come to us and ask us what we need to have research. No one has ever come into the South Bronx that I know of, or into Harlem, and said, what do y'all think needs to be done? We read these research papers and that they spend millions of dollars on stuff that we go, aha, all they had to do was ask us. We would have told them that. They didn't have to spend $1 million on, you know, why people are smoking crack. We can tell you why people you know? You don't have to spend $1 million on trying to figure out like, gee, you know, women go out and have sex so they can, you know, they buy drugs and then their children get infected with HIV. Like, talk to us first. No one has ever just came and said, what do you think you need? We need that forum someplace just to ask us what we think we need to have done.
We have one of the world experts in community-based participatory research. I don't want to point fingers because he's just back from sabbatical, which I heard was a good thing earlier this morning. So Laurie Bellman is actually representing that space, which is really at the level of starting to penetrate other areas of research here, centered around HIV, teenage behavior, adolescent behavior. Do you want to comment, Laurie? Do you have your voice back?
We are one of the few who actually went to the community and said, what do you want? And that's because one branch of NIH, the National Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities, is willing to fund research that allows us to put some of the control for research in the hands of the community. And I would say most NIH institutes are not willing to do that. But we said we want to partner with adolescents and figure out which health disparity is most important to them. What we had been doing was HIV prevention with adolescents, but in our collaborative group with them, and they were in the majority and they made the decisions around this research, they picked mental health. And so we've been working now for several years in the community, testing new interventions in schools and community health centers to bring mental health services to adolescents in a way that they will welcome. So I encourage people to use the model you so well described, which shares power with communities and gives the community a voice in deciding what's important. We can bring the expertise in the research, but you bring the expertise in what's important.
Thanks.
I had wanted to ask the question because I think the model that Dr. Gahl presented was the ultimate in retail medicine. And one of the issues has to do with wholesale and the issue for Joann, of the role of advocacy and research around advocacy that is part of the Bronx Health Link. And if you'd speak to that, because that's really the public health model that's beginning to grow here at Einstein.
Me?
You.
Yeah, that was your question.
Here's the microphone. Retail or wholesale?
Retail, yeah, no, I got caught up on that and I wrote it down, retail. I don't know. Give me some more detail. I'm a little...
How do you do advocacy, and what kind of help, what kind of research support do you need to do the kind of advocacy you know that you need to do?
Well, we do advocacy on different levels. I mean, there's community-based advocacy. You can't engage a community in advocacy unless they know the extent of the problem. Folks know that poverty is a problem, but they don't know, when they see that number and they see the pie charts, they say, that's not fair. You know, the little graph that I showed with the birth outcomes in the Upper East Side compared to the one in the Bronx, that's a very direct sort of example, and you engage people that way. So community-based advocacy is one level. Then we do community boards. same thing. Advise them of, what's going on. We use a lot of data from the New York City Department of Health. We use a lot of the data that we get from focus groups and interviewing people. My staff refuses to go anywhere with me because invariably if I'm sitting on a bus and I see someone, I will start a conversation with them and ask them what's going on. Who do you go to see for medical care? With local elected officials, they're also looking at they want to see that data, Hal. Just going in and making a very strong argument that we need more health care just doesn't cut it anymore. They really want to see a justifiable, data-driven, objective case for increased funding. So we could use data from anyone, but it has to be something that we could use. So it can't be spreadsheets that are very long and complicated. It has to be very direct.
So the advocacy groups that I deal with share a common disorder, and that's what brings them together. And I think in a wholesale community like yours, you have to have some commonality and some sharing, and that can be manifest by people getting together and talking with each other, and then they can understand that they share that, and then create some advocacy. But certainly that's what it is in the rare disease community.
Along those lines, Bill and I have been very fortunate to partner with a organization called the Cystinosis Research Network, where one of the past founders is here, Mary Beth Krumnacher, who now works for NORD, represents rare disease cystinosis. And I think one of the remarkable things about this experience has been that as physician investigators, we are with families every 3 years for a 3 or 4 day period where they interchange with us their concerns about the research that we're trying to help them with, and they are advocates and we're advocates together. It's a great experience in partnership, and we learn a lot from each other. Another area which I just want to mention, which relates also to what Bill is doing and what we heard this morning, is a challenge in pediatric research for international collaboration for biobanks. So we are involved. There was a meeting of the CHOC, the Children's Health Oversight Committee of the CTSAs last March at the NIH, and one day was devoted to trying to stimulate these international exchanges and identify the barriers ethically and also regulatory for pediatric registries, biobanks, and studies. And that's going to be taken up at a meeting next month at the NIH.
I mean, I think one of the threads that I see after 30 years of spending doing translational studies in N of 11, because that was all that was needed to get a good p-value, from the community and the New England Journal, is science has pulled us all away. I mean, what you're hearing these folks talk about is that the money that we get has to be spread even thinner. It doesn't all get spent in the community. We are collaborating with people in Rochester, New York, and in Nashville, Tennessee, and Baton Rouge, and all over the country. And I think that the goal here is to drag our partners in the Bronx into that and not remain in the sort of the sheltered world where our population, our demographic is the only thing that our scientists and physicians care about. The physicians, of course, because care is one-on-one. But systematic change, and research is part of systematic change, is really creeping out of or launching out of the academic walls into the national and global space. So I think finding that balance between what we do locally and what we do globally, there are a number of investigators here who have come to me and said, you know what, we have this new global health activity going on at Einstein, not quite a center yet, but Alan Spiegel promises that we will have one, a director that is. And I'm caught between the horns of a dilemma. Do I do my research in the Bronx, or do I do it in Africa? And so those are going to be some really tough questions that all of us have to negotiate the barriers, because disease is disease after all, and that's not going to limit the scope. Ed.
So, in the space of engaging the community, if there are big research questions, how does diet affect obesity, how does smoking affect cancer, it's very easy to engage the community if the effort is put into. But the overwhelming majority of research are really micro pieces of the puzzle. if you take a look at the types of research grants that people are involved in, they're looking at one enzyme or one gene or one SNP. And in good conscience, you can't really tell the community that if we had the answer to that question, that's going to solve it or really benefit directly the community. So nevertheless, we need samples, we need DNA, we need blood, we need participation, we need interviews. So how do you get the community engaged in the 95% of studies without making them feel that we're taking advantage of them, even though we can't tell them that the answer to this study, even if it's successful, is going to really directly benefit them?
Well, you tell them just that.
And
you know,
what do you think the response is?
Well, the response is you need to sort of tell them that this is part of a long-term process that will benefit them, the community, maybe not right now, but in 10 years and 15, and people will listen. But they need to know something. And the perception is that they know nothing of what's going on behind the ivory tower.
So last year, Paloma told us that the community is very afraid of genetic research for various reasons.
Right.
So if we tell the community, we want to do a genetic analysis because, you know, we're going to try to figure out whether this gene affects that enzyme that may affect something else, and even if we find out the answer, that's not going to help you, and they're suspicious. What do you think the response will be?
They'll still be suspicious, but I think that we have an ethical responsibility to engage them at every stage of research. It's some of it they'll feel uncomfortable with and they'll just not want to participate, but we have a responsibility to tell them.
I think Paul will comment.
It's not an easy.
Sorry.
It's not an easy situation, and I understand that. I'm sorry. Some of the research is very difficult to understand, but you can't assume that people won't listen. You just tell them it's not going to help right now. It may never help, but we have a responsibility to try to get more knowledge, and we may find something.
Joann, I was going to use the word translation in a different way, and allude to the fact that what Paul didn't get to talk about, and maybe he'll mention, is the precept behind this review board that we're putting together is not that the research will be approved by the review board, but that there's an engagement process. And if you look at the technical content of the posters, you look at the work that the junior faculty are doing at Einstein, who are part of the career track that Paul's talked about, a lot of it is very technical. So I think by its very nature, bringing that kind of work to the CCRB will begin to at least start the conversation, because I don't think that we intend to all be experts. I mean, Bill's humility and ability to say that there's so much we don't know and we have to acknowledge that, I think is important. And I think standing back from what we think we know versus what we really do. But I do think that there's an issue of translating, and that is to say, what does genomic medicine really mean? What is privacy? What are safe harbor data? What is really HIPAA protected? How can we backtrace people? This is the kind of stuff that will come up in the review process of projects, right, Paul?
Well, yeah, and we'll learn about what the messages are to communicate. I don't think we know that very well. Thinking about Ed's comment, yes, it would make sense to us that people are looking for direct benefit from their research. But I may say this wrong because this wasn't my study, but I remember I was right down the hall from Sylvia Smoller when the Women's Health Initiative was starting here. And what I remember seeing was this understanding among the research team that the people who were enrolling in that trial had no expectation of benefit for themselves. It was for the next generation and the generation to come. And so the message that went out there in recruitment was for your daughters and granddaughters. And maybe there's a way that we can learn to tap into that. Yes, small incremental research that won't benefit you directly or now or maybe for some time to come, but
for the rare ones and the others, you can't have 50 investigators each going out and reaching out to the community. It's neither cost-effective nor works. But what you need to rely, as I was alluding to, the mantle of goodwill, that as an institution we educate the community that we have a large number of such protocols. They undergo review by institutional review boards. We have protections in place, and while each one may not affect the life of the Bronx right now, as a class, they may improve us for the next generation. And most importantly, there is no guinea pig harm type, and that we respect the community. And I think institutionally, one can do that in such a way that then the class of protocols have trust. And I've certainly found that institutionally community relations have been good, that one can then most of the time establish.
I didn't
I'll get
know,
to Peter. Yeah, go ahead.
Sylvia, when she first started the cohort study, but I knew someone who had been involved as a participant in the women's studies, who spoke very highly of her, who had nothing but good things to say about what happened during her participation in the study and the results. And because she spoke so highly of their work, I was very interested in finding out how they would address some of the issues with the SOUL study. It has not always been...
SOUL stands for Study of Latinos.
Of Latinos. It has not always been the friendliest of relationships. We've had our issues as the CAB, but there is a commitment to engaging the community and involving us. And although we've gone through some ups and downs, the CAB, the 13 members of the CAB started 3 years ago, and we're still together, and we're still working with Sylvia and with Robert. So that speaks very highly, I think.
So does it bother you that SOUL is called the Framingham of the Bronx, or should we...
Listen, I don't care what they call it. I personally want to see very good results. It is the first time that they're studying the Puerto Rican community in large numbers, and for me, that's very important. So the end result and the outcome is what's important to me.
Peter, let me just... I pointed to Peter. Dr. Selwyn is chair of Family and Social Medicine.
I just want to comment on this notion of what's sort of relevant and explainable to the community. I think it goes beyond getting people's goodwill and patience in realizing that research takes time and that we only look at small pieces of things. I think as an institution, we have continued, and there's evidence that this is changing, but we've continued to miss an opportunity in appreciating what the impact of the scientific agenda is that goes beyond the more proximal lab-based basic science that is clearly limited and short-term in terms of its implications, and what more distal types of studies could do to really benefit the community in more relevant ways in both the short term and the long term. I don't think we're going to find an answer to the problem the community faces with epidemic diabetes in the Bronx by finding the right gene. I think we'll find the answer by working with the community to identify at the interface between behavior and outcomes, or care and outcomes, or what opportunities for exercise and access to fresh fruits and vegetables exist in communities, that there's much more in the health services and the distal end of the translational spectrum that I think we collectively have really brought ourselves together to address in the past. So I think we have to do both a better job of communicating what the basic science is, but a better job of really looking at what is a legitimate research agenda in an institution like this. And I think we've been much too narrow in how we've traditionally conceived of that.
That's a great point, and I see Alan Spiegel having returned. We are going to be engaging in a broader conversation at the school in research planning towards the spring, as some of you have heard. So this is a really fertile time to begin to think about the agenda and broadening the scope.